Secrets of the most dangerous queens in history. History remembers them as legends, as monsters, as cautionary tales. But these were not fantasy creatures. They were women who looked their enemies in the eye and did what men only whispered about. They poisoned emperors. They orchestrated palace coups. They seduced and manipulated and murdered, all to claw their way to power in worlds that had no place for them. And the most shocking part? Their methods worked. 3 women, 3 different empires, 3 stories of ambition so ruthless, so cunning, so absolutely brilliant that historians are still arguing about their legacies 500, 1,000, even 2,000 years later. This is their documentary. This is their truth. This is history's darkest secrets. Story 1. Wu Zetian, the slave girl who murdered her baby to become China's only female. Emperor Story 2. Agrippina the Younger, the Roman mother who poisoned an emperor and slept with her son. Story 3. Catherine de' Medici, the French queen, who made murder an art form. PLs like and subscribe our channel for more historical stories. Story. Wu Zetian, the slave girl who murdered her baby to become China's only female emperor, the baby's last breath. Opening hook. Maximum impact. You are standing outside the private chambers of Empress Wang in the forbidden city of Tang Dynasty, China. In the year 654 CE. Inside this room, something unthinkable is about to happen. A woman is about to murder her own infant daughter. Not in rage, not in desperation, but as a calculated political move. And this murder will work. It will destroy an empress, elevate a concubine to ultimate power, and change Chinese history forever. The woman's name is Wu Zhao. You know her now as Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to officially rule as emperor, not empress. But in 654 CE, she is just 29 years old, a former slave girl who has clawed her way to becoming the Emperor Gaozong's favorite concubine. She has power, but it is precarious. Empress Wang stands between her and the throne. And Wu Zhao has just devised a plan so ruthless, so coldly brilliant, that it will shock even the jaded palace officials who have seen every form of treachery imaginable. She has given birth to a daughter 3 days ago. The baby is healthy, beautiful, with Wu Zhao's dark eyes and delicate features. Palace tradition demands that the reigning empress visit to offer congratulations and inspect the child. Empress Wang is kind, politically naive, genuinely interested in children. She comes to Wu Zhao's chambers alone without witnesses to see the newborn. Wu Zhao welcomes her with appropriate deference. She presents the baby wrapped in silk. Empress Wang coos over the infant, touches the tiny hand, speaks the conventional blessings. She stays perhaps 10 minutes, then departs. She has done nothing wrong. She has simply performed the social ritual expected of the reigning empress. And she has just been trapped. The moment Empress Wang leaves, Wu Zhao dismisses all servants from her chambers. She is alone now with her 3-day-old daughter. What happens in the next few minutes no one sees directly, but within an hour Wu Zhao begins screaming. Servants rush in. The baby is dead. There are no visible wounds, no signs of violence. The infant simply stopped breathing. Wu Zhao is hysterical, or appears to be. She demands to know who was in her chambers. The servants testify, no one except Empress Wang. Wu Zhao's face transforms. Through tears, she accuses the empress of murdering her child out of jealousy. The accusation is politically brilliant. Empress Wang is childless after years of marriage to Emperor Gaozong. Wu Zhao, a mere concubine, has just given birth. The motive seems plausible. A jealous, barren empress killing the concubine's baby. Emperor Gaozong investigates. There is no evidence either way. A 3-day-old infant might die of natural causes. It happens frequently in the 7th century. Or the baby might have been smothered, suffocated, killed in a way that leaves no marks. The timeline is suspicious. Empress Wang was the only outsider to enter the chambers. She had opportunity. The accusation of motive is psychologically compelling. But here is what the historical sources suggest. What court officials later whispered. What eventually became accepted by historians. Wu Zhao murdered her own daughter. She waited until Empress Wang visited, then killed the baby herself, creating a crime with only one plausible suspect. It was a sacrifice, a brutal, calculated sacrifice of her own child to eliminate her primary rival. This is the woman you need to understand. This is the mind that will rule China for half a century, that will order the deaths of hundreds of people, that will break every convention about women and power, that will ultimately declare herself not empress but emperor, taking a title no woman before or since has held in Chinese history. But she was not born to power. She was born to nothing. Wu Zhao was born in 624 CE in Wenshui, a provincial town in what is now Shaanxi province. Her father, Wu Xiyue, was a timber merchant who made a fortune supplying wood to the Tang imperial government. He was wealthy but common, not aristocracy, not educated elite. In Tang China's rigid class system, merchants ranked near the bottom of respectable professions, just above actors and prostitutes. Wu Zhao's mother, Lady Yang, was Wu Xiyue's second wife, also from a merchant family. She had 3 daughters with Wu Xiyue but no sons. This was a catastrophe in Tang China. Daughters were expensive burdens who required dowries and brought no family prestige. Sons carried on the family name, took the civil service exams, achieved official positions. A merchant with only daughters was a man without a future. Wu Xiyue died when Wu Zhao was 12. His wealth passed to sons from his first marriage, adult half-brothers who immediately made clear that the second wife and her daughters were unwelcome. Lady Yang had no legal protection, no property rights, no male relatives to defend her interests. She and her daughters were destitute. This is crucial to understanding Wu Zhao. She spent her childhood wealthy, her adolescence impoverished. She learned that security was an illusion, that power could be stripped away instantly, that women without male protection were utterly vulnerable. These lessons shaped everything that came after. At age 13, Wu Zhao's beauty attracted attention. She was recruited, or more accurately, conscripted, into Emperor Taizong's palace as a low-ranking concubine. This sounds prestigious but was actually closer to slavery. The Tang imperial harem contained thousands of women organized in a rigid hierarchy. At the bottom were girls like Wu Zhao, beauties from non-aristocratic families who served as maids, entertainers and occasional sexual partners for the emperor if he noticed them, which he usually did not. Wu Zhao was given the title Kairen, talented person, 5th rank out of 8 in the concubine hierarchy. She was 13 years old. She would spend the next 13 years in Emperor Taizong's palace, rarely seeing the emperor himself, serving higher-ranked concubines, learning the brutal politics of the harem where thousands of women competed for the attention of one man. The harem was not romantic. It was a prison disguised as luxury. Women lived in beautiful quarters, wore silk, ate refined food, but they could not leave, could not marry, could not have normal lives. Most would never bear children, never achieve any rank beyond their starting position, never matter to anyone. They would grow old serving other women, eventually dying forgotten, their bodies cremated and ashes scattered without ceremony. Wu Zhao refused this fate. She studied. The Tang Palace had libraries, and low-ranking concubines had time to read. Wu Zhao learned classical Chinese literature, history, calligraphy, music, poetry. She was not supposed to be educated. Women of her class were expected to be ornamental. But no one stopped her. She was just another teenager among thousands beneath notice, and she observed. She watched the palace politics with the attention of someone whose life depended on understanding power. She saw which women rose in rank and why. She saw which tactics worked. Flattery, sexuality, pregnancy, but also intelligence, usefulness, the ability to make oneself indispensable. She saw which women were destroyed and how, through scandals, accusations, rivalries that turned violent. When Emperor Taizong died in 649 CE, Wu Zhao was 25 years old. She had spent half her life in the imperial harem and had barely spoken to the emperor. By custom, all of Taizong's concubines should now enter a Buddhist convent for the rest of their lives. replaced by a new generation of women for the new emperor. Wu Zhao faced a choice: become a nun and spend decades in a monastery, or find a way to stay in the palace. She found a way. During Taizong's final illness, Wu Zhao had attracted the attention of his son Li Ji, who would become Emperor Gaozong. The historical sources are discreet about exactly what happened, but the implication is clear. Wu Zhao and Li Ji began a relationship before Taizong died. This was technically incest. She was his father's concubine, and by the logic of the harem, this made her a kind of stepmother. It was also illegal, scandalous, and politically dangerous. But Wu Zhao had learned that rules were for people without power. People with power made rules. She needed power, and Li Ji was her path to it. When Gaozong became emperor, he officially sent Wu Zhao to a Buddhist convent as required. She went, shaved her head, took the vows, but within a year, Gaozong brought her back to the palace. The official excuse was that he needed her advice on palace management. The reality was that he wanted her. Empress Wang, Gaozong's wife, initially welcomed Wu Zhao's return. This was a fatal mistake born of political naivety. Wang believed that bringing back a beautiful, intelligent concubine would distract the emperor from his current favorite, consort Xiao. It was a classic harem strategy. Introduce a new rival to your enemy. Wang thought she could control Wu Zhao, use her, then discard her. She drastically underestimated who she was dealing with. Wu Zhao became Gaozong's favorite almost immediately. She was more intelligent than Empress Wang, more sexually skilled than consort Xiao, more politically cunning than both combined. Within 2 years, she had eclipsed both women in the emperor's affections. But being a favorite concubine was not enough. Favorites could fall out of favor. Favorites could be replaced. Wu Zhao wanted security, and security meant being empress. But there was already an empress. Empress Wang held that position by right of her aristocratic birth and her marriage to Gaozong before he became emperor. Removing her would require something extraordinary, a scandal so severe that it would justify the unprecedented act of deposing the reigning empress. Wu Zhao engineered that scandal with her daughter's murder. The accusation against Empress Wang was devastating. The emperor wavered. Palace officials debated. For 2 years, the question hung in the air. Should the empress be deposed for the suspected murder of a concubine's child? In 656 CE, Emperor Gaozong made his decision. Empress Wang and consort Xiao were both stripped of their titles, officially for plotting against Wu Zhao and her daughter. They were imprisoned in a remote section of the palace, and Wu Zhao was elevated to empress, a shocking promotion that violated every convention of aristocratic hierarchy. She was common-born, a former low-ranking concubine, now the most powerful woman in China, but she was not finished. Empress Wang and consort Xiao, though imprisoned, were still alive. They could be restored if political winds changed. Wu Zhao could not allow that possibility. What happened next is documented in multiple historical sources, each telling essentially the same horrifying story. Wu Zhao ordered both women tortured. Their hands and feet were cut off. They were then placed in wine vats, a form of slow execution where the alcohol would seep into their wounds while they drowned gradually in the liquid. They died over the course of days, conscious and in agony. Before Empress Wang died, she reportedly cursed Wu Zhao, "May Wu be reborn as a mouse and may I be reborn as a cat, so that I can chase her and catch her and bite through her throat every lifetime." Wu Zhao, superstitious despite her ruthlessness, was apparently disturbed enough by this curse that she banned cats from the palace for the rest of her life. This was the woman who was now Empress of China. She had murdered her infant daughter, framed a rival, and tortured 2 women to death. She was 32 years old. She would rule in one form or another for the next 45 years. And she was just beginning. But the question that haunts this story is simple. How? How does a former slave girl, a woman in a society that gave women no formal power, rise to become emperor. How many people did she have to kill? What methods did she use? And what does her success reveal about power, gender, and the price of ambition in imperial China? The answers require understanding not just Wu Zetian's ruthlessness, but her brilliance. Not just her crimes, but her genuine political skill, because she was not simply a murderess who got lucky. She was one of the most capable administrators in Chinese history, and her reign, despite its brutality, was marked by genuine achievement. Section 2. The Secret Police and the Thousand Deaths. You need to understand that Wu Zetian did not simply murder her way to power. She was genuinely brilliant at governance, which makes her story more disturbing, not less. A pure monster would be easier to comprehend. But Wu Zetian was a monster who also reformed the civil service, promoted talented officials regardless of class, expanded education, and presided over one of Tang China's most prosperous periods. She killed hundreds of people, and she also made the empire stronger. These two facts existed simultaneously, and that contradiction is what makes her truly dangerous. When she became empress in 656 CE, she faced a problem that would have destroyed a less capable person. The aristocracy hated her. Tang China's elite families, the ones who had held power for generations, who staffed the bureaucracy, who controlled the military, viewed Wu Zetian as an upstart, a commoner who had no business wearing imperial robes. They whispered that she was illegitimate, that her elevation violated proper order, that a woman from merchant stock could never truly be empress. Wu Zetian's response was methodical and ruthless. She could not simply kill all the aristocrats, there were too many, and their families controlled too much. Instead, she needed to make them afraid, to create an atmosphere where opposing her meant not just political failure but death. She needed a terror apparatus that would allow her to eliminate specific enemies while keeping the broader aristocracy compliant through fear. She created the most sophisticated secret police system China had yet seen. The official name was the Censorate, but everyone called it the Cruel Officials. It was led by a series of men who were themselves from common backgrounds, men who owed their positions entirely to Wu Zetian, and who therefore had absolute loyalty to her. The most notorious was Lai Junchen, a former petty criminal who became Wu Zetian's chief interrogator and executioner. Lai Junchen was given extraordinary powers. He could arrest anyone on suspicion of treason, could torture them without oversight, could execute them without trial if he deemed them guilty, and Wu Zetian encouraged him to be creative. Lai developed a reputation for inventing new torture methods, each more horrific than the last. There was the Hell's Ladder, a device that slowly broke every bone in a prisoner's body, starting with the toes and working upward. There was the Donkey's Revenge, a triangular wooden frame that prisoners were forced to straddle while weights were hung from their legs, causing the sharp edge to cut into their genitals. There was the Kang of Eternal Sleep, a wooden board fixed around the prisoner's neck so heavy that they could not lie down or sleep, eventually dying from exhaustion and despair. But Lai's most effective tool was not physical torture. It was psychological. He developed a system where prisoners were encouraged to implicate others in exchange for reduced sentences. If you were arrested for treason, you could save yourself by naming 10 other conspirators. Those 10 would then be arrested, and each of them could save themselves by naming 10 more. This created an exponential growth in arrests, and more importantly, it destroyed trust throughout the aristocracy. No one knew who might betray them. Families turned on each other. Friends denounced friends. The historical records suggest that during Wu Zetian's reign, more than 1,000 officials and aristocrats were executed for treason. This number is probably conservative. Many executions went unrecorded. Many people simply disappeared into Lai Junchen's prisons and were never seen again. The actual death toll might be 2,000, 3,000, possibly more. And the treason charges were often fabricated or based on nothing. A poet who wrote a verse that could be interpreted as criticism? Treason. An official who was too slow to congratulate Wu Zetian on a birthday? Treason. A general who was popular with his troops and therefore a potential threat? Treason. A merchant who refused to donate money to imperial projects? Treason. Wu Zetian understood that the purpose of terror is not just to eliminate enemies but to make everyone else compliant. If people believe that opposition means certain death, they will not oppose you. If people believe that even mild criticism might be interpreted as treason, they will remain silent. If people believe that even their family might betray them to save themselves, they will trust no one, and therefore will not conspire against you. This was governance through fear, and it was extraordinarily effective. But Wu Zetian was not purely destructive. Simultaneously with building her terror apparatus, she was reforming the civil service in ways that genuinely improved imperial administration. This is the contradiction that makes her fascinating and disturbing. In traditional Tang China, high government positions were reserved for aristocratic families. The civil service examination system existed in theory, but in practice only aristocrats had the education and connections to pass the exams and secure appointments. This meant that the bureaucracy was staffed by people loyal to their families first, and the emperor second. Wu Zetian broke this system. She expanded the examination system, making it genuinely meritocratic. She established new schools that provided education to commoners and merchants' sons. She personally reviewed examination results, looking for talented candidates from non-aristocratic backgrounds. And then she promoted these men to high positions, creating a new class of officials who owed everything to her. This was politically brilliant. The new officials had no family networks to fall back on, no aristocratic connections that might protect them if they betrayed her. They were completely dependent on Wu Zetian's favor, which meant they were absolutely loyal, and many of them were genuinely capable administrators because they had been selected on merit rather than birth. Wu Zetian also reformed military recruitment, opening officer positions to non-aristocrats. She expanded trade, reducing tariffs and encouraging merchants. She commissioned massive public works projects, canals, roads, granaries, that improved infrastructure and provided employment. She patronized Buddhism, building temples and supporting monasteries, which gave her religious legitimacy and created a network of Buddhist officials who could counter Confucian aristocrats' influence. The result was that Tang China, under Wu Zetian, was prosperous, well-administered and strong. The economy grew. The military won battles on the frontier. The capital, Chang'an, became one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world. By most objective measures, Wu Zetian was an effective ruler. But this effectiveness was purchased with blood. The prosperity came alongside the terror. The efficient administration coexisted with the torture chambers. And Wu Zetian never hesitated to sacrifice individuals for what she perceived as the greater good, which was ultimately her own power. In 1660 CE, Emperor Gaozong suffered a stroke. He survived but was partially paralyzed, had difficulty speaking, and suffered from chronic headaches. He could no longer manage the daily administration of the empire. Wu Zetian stepped in. At first, she acted as regent, making decisions on her husband's behalf. But gradually she simply took over. By 665 CE, everyone understood that Wu Zetian was the real ruler of China, with Gaozong as a figurehead who approved whatever she decided. This was unprecedented. China had empresses before, but they ruled through their sons as regents or through their husbands as influential wives. No woman had ever been the acknowledged center of power while the male emperor was still alive. The Confucian officials were horrified. Women were not supposed to rule. The natural order placed men above women in the cosmic hierarchy. A female ruler was seen as unnatural as a rooster laying eggs. Wu Zetian's response was characteristically ruthless. When a group of officials petitioned for Gaozong to resume control, she had them arrested, tortured until they confessed to treason, and executed. Their families were exiled. Their properties were confiscated. The message was clear. Anyone who questioned Wu Zetian's authority would be destroyed. But she also understood that she needed ideological justification, not just terror. She could not simply rule by force forever. She needed a narrative that made her power seem legitimate, even natural. She found that narrative in Buddhism. While Confucianism emphasized hierarchy with men above women, Buddhism was more flexible. Buddhist texts contained prophecies about a female world ruler who would usher in an age of enlightenment. Wu Zetian commissioned Buddhist scholars to study these texts, to interpret them in ways that suggested she was this prophesied ruler. She sponsored the translation of sutras that emphasized gender equality in spiritual matters. She built massive Buddhist monuments, including the Longmen Grotto's spectacular Buddha statues carved into cliffside stone. The Buddhist establishment, grateful for her patronage and intimidated by her power, declared that Wu Zetian was indeed a bodhisattva, an enlightened being, born female to demonstrate that gender was irrelevant to spiritual authority. If gender did not matter for spiritual power, why should it matter for political power? This was sophisticated propaganda, combining genuine religious belief with political manipulation. Wu Zetian probably believed at least some of it. She was not cynically pretending to be Buddhist. She genuinely practiced the religion, meditated, studied sutras, but she also understood that Buddhism gave her something Confucianism never could: a framework for female rule that seemed cosmically ordained rather than politically aberrant. In 683 CE, Emperor Gaozong died. He was 55 years old and had been essentially powerless for the final 18 years of his life. Wu Zetian was 59 years old and had been effectively ruling China for nearly 2 decades. Now she faced a question. Would she rule as Empress Dowager through her sons as tradition demanded, or would she claim power directly? She chose a middle path that demonstrated her political skill. She installed her son Li Jie as Emperor Zhongzong. He was weak, easily manipulated, and understood that his mother was the real power. But Li Jie's wife, Empress Wei, was ambitious and began trying to influence policy, to build her own faction. Wu Zetian could not tolerate this. 6 weeks after Li Jie became emperor, she deposed him, exiled him, and installed another son, Li Dan, as Emperor Ruizong. Li Dan was even more compliant. He essentially served as a rubber stamp for whatever his mother decided. For the next 7 years, Wu Zetian ruled through him. But this arrangement was unstable. As long as there was a male emperor, even a powerless one, Confucian officials could argue that proper order existed. They could tell themselves that a man was emperor and his mother was merely advising him, even though everyone knew this was fiction. Wu Zetian wanted to make reality match appearance. In 690 CE, at age 66, she made her move. She forced Li Dan to abdicate. She declared that the Tang dynasty was ended and a new dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, had begun. And she declared herself emperor, not empress, not empress dowager, but emperor. The first and only woman in Chinese history to hold that title officially. This was breathtaking in its audacity. No woman had ever done this. Even the most powerful empress dowagers had maintained the fiction of male rule. Wu Zetian abolished that fiction. She took the title Huangdi Emperor, which was grammatically and politically masculine. She sat on the dragon throne in male imperial robes. She performed the sacred rituals that only emperors could perform. She declared herself the equal of the greatest male emperors in Chinese history. The Confucian establishment was apoplectic. This violated everything they believed about cosmic order, about gender, about legitimacy. Surely the gods would punish this presumption. Surely natural disasters would follow. But they did not. The harvests were good. The empire remained prosperous. The military continued winning battles. Wu Zetian's reign as emperor from 690 to 705 CE was marked by stability and success. This posed a profound problem for Confucian ideology. How to explain that female rule, which should have been cosmically impossible, was working? The answer they eventually settled on was that Wu Zetian was an exception, a unique aberration that proved the rule rather than challenged it. They acknowledged her capability, while insisting that her reign demonstrated why women should never rule, because achieving power required her to be so ruthlessly cruel that she became more monster than woman. But this explanation misses something crucial. Wu Zetian was not more cruel than male emperors. The first Tang emperor, Taizong, killed his brothers and forced his father to abdicate. The Han Dynasty founder Liu Bang betrayed allies and executed rivals wholesale. Chinese history is full of male rulers who murdered their way to power and then presided over prosperous reigns. The difference is that when men did it, it was seen as the unfortunate necessity of politics. When Wu Zetian did it, it was seen as evidence of female monstrosity. She ruled for 15 years as emperor. During that time, she continued the policies that had made her effective: meritocratic examination systems, Buddhist patronage, efficient administration, and brutal suppression of opposition. She was approximately 80 years old when palace officials finally forced her to abdicate in 705 CE, restoring her son to the throne and ending the Zhou dynasty. She died that same year, shortly after her abdication. She was buried alongside Emperor Gaozong in a joint tomb that still exists today. Her tombstone, by her own instruction, was left blank. No words, no epitaph. Scholars have debated for centuries what this blank stone means. Was it humility, suggesting her achievements were beyond words? Was it defiance, refusing to let history judge her? Was it acknowledgement that her legacy would be contested forever? But perhaps the blank stone means something simpler and more disturbing. That Wu Zetian understood she had transcended categories. She was not a good empress or a bad empress, not a capable ruler or a cruel tyrant. She was something that Chinese tradition had no vocabulary to describe. A woman who held the ultimate male power, who murdered her own child to achieve it, who tortured thousands to maintain it, and who ruled successfully for half a century despite violating every norm about gender and authority. And the question that haunts her story, the question that makes her one of history's most dangerous queens, is this: was she extraordinary because she was cruel, or was she forced to be cruel because she was attempting something extraordinary? Would a woman rising from nothing to supreme power in 7th century China have been possible without the baby murder, the torture chambers, the 1,000 deaths? Or was all that violence the price that patriarchal society demanded from any woman who tried to rule? The answer to that question determines whether we see Wu Zetian as a monster who happened to be competent, or as a brilliant administrator who was forced to become monstrous by the system she was trying to overcome. And that question, more than anything else, is what makes her story relevant not just as history, but as a continuing debate about power, gender, and the costs of ambition. Wu Zetian also reformed military recruitment, opening officer positions to non-aristocrats. She expanded trade, reducing tariffs and encouraging merchants. She commissioned massive public works projects, canals, roads, granaries, that improved infrastructure and provided employment. She patronized Buddhism, building temples and supporting monasteries, which gave her religious legitimacy, and created a network of Buddhist officials who could counter Confucian aristocrats' influence. The result was that Tang China under Wu Zetian was prosperous, well-administered and strong. The economy grew. The military won battles on the frontier. The capital, Chang'an, became one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world. By most objective measures, Wu Zetian was an effective ruler. But this effectiveness was purchased with blood. The prosperity came alongside the terror. The efficient administration coexisted with the torture chambers. And Wu Zetian never hesitated to sacrifice individuals for what she perceived as the greater good, which was ultimately her own power. In 660 CE, Emperor Gaozong suffered a stroke. He survived but was partially paralyzed, had difficulty speaking, and suffered from chronic headaches. He could no longer manage the daily administration of the empire. Wu Zetian stepped in. At first she acted as regent, making decisions on her husband's behalf. But gradually she simply took over. By 665 CE, everyone understood that Wu Zetian was the real ruler of China, with Gaozong as a figurehead who approved whatever she decided. This was unprecedented. China had empresses before, but they ruled through their sons as regents or through their husbands as influential wives. No woman had ever been the acknowledged center of power while the male emperor was still alive. The Confucian officials were horrified. Women were not supposed to rule. The natural order placed men above women in the cosmic hierarchy. A female ruler was seen as unnatural as a rooster laying eggs. Wu Zetian's response was characteristically ruthless. When a group of officials petitioned for Gaozong to resume control, she had them arrested, tortured until they confessed to treason, and executed. Their families were exiled. Their properties were confiscated. The message was clear. Anyone who questioned Wu Zetian's authority would be destroyed. But she also understood that she needed ideological justification, not just terror. She could not simply rule by force forever. She needed a narrative that made her power seem legitimate, even natural. She found that narrative in Buddhism. While Confucianism emphasized hierarchy with men above women, Buddhism was more flexible. Buddhist texts contained prophecies about a female world ruler who would usher in an age of enlightenment. Wu Zetian commissioned Buddhist scholars to study these texts, to interpret them in ways that suggested she was this prophesied ruler. She sponsored the translation of sutras that emphasized gender equality in spiritual matters. She built massive Buddhist monuments, including the Longmen Grotto's spectacular Buddha statues carved into cliffside stone. The Buddhist establishment, grateful for her patronage and intimidated by her power, declared that Wu Zetian was indeed a bodhisattva, an enlightened being, born female to demonstrate that gender was irrelevant to spiritual authority. If gender did not matter for spiritual power, why should it matter for political power? This was sophisticated propaganda, combining genuine religious belief with political manipulation. Wu Zetian probably believed at least some of it. She was not cynically pretending to be Buddhist. She genuinely practiced the religion, meditated, studied sutras, but she also understood that Buddhism gave her something Confucianism never could: a framework for female rule that seemed cosmically ordained rather than politically aberrant. In 683 CE, Emperor Gaozong died. He was 55 years old and had been essentially powerless for the final 18 years of his life. Wu Zetian was 59 years old and had been effectively ruling China for nearly 2 decades. Now she faced a question. Would she rule as Empress Dowager through her sons as tradition demanded, or would she claim power directly? She chose a middle path that demonstrated her political skill. She installed her son Lija as Emperor Zhongzong. He was weak, easily manipulated, and understood that his mother was the real power. But Lija's wife, Empress Wei, was ambitious and began trying to influence policy, to build her own faction. Wu Zetian could not tolerate this. 6 weeks after Lija became emperor, she deposed him, exiled him, and installed another son, Li Dan, as Emperor Ruizong. Li Dan was even more compliant. He essentially served as a rubber stamp for whatever his mother decided. For the next 7 years, Wu Zetian ruled through him. But this arrangement was unstable. As long as there was a male emperor, even a powerless one, Confucian officials could argue that proper order existed. They could tell themselves that a man was emperor and his mother was merely advising him, even though everyone knew this was fiction. Wu Zetian wanted to make reality match appearance. In 690 CE, at age 66, she made her move. She forced Li Dan to abdicate. She declared that the Tang dynasty was ended, and a new dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, had begun. And she declared herself emperor, not empress, not Empress Dowager, but emperor. The first and only woman in Chinese history to hold that title officially. This was breathtaking in its audacity. No woman had ever done this. Even the most powerful empress dowagers had maintained the fiction of male rule. Wu Zetian abolished that fiction. She took the title Huangdi, Emperor, which was grammatically and politically masculine. She sat on the dragon throne in male imperial robes. She performed the sacred rituals that only emperors could perform. She declared herself the equal of the greatest male emperors in Chinese history. The Confucian establishment was apoplectic. This violated everything they believed about cosmic order, about gender, about legitimacy. Surely the gods would punish this presumption. Surely natural disasters would follow, but they did not. The harvests were good. The empire remained prosperous. The military continued winning battles. Wu Zetian's reign as emperor from 690 to 705 CE was marked by stability and success. This posed a profound problem for Confucian ideology. How to explain that female rule, which should have been cosmically impossible, was working? The answer they eventually settled on was that Wu Zetian was an exception, a unique aberration that proved the rule rather than challenged it. They acknowledged her capability while insisting that her reign demonstrated why women should never rule, because achieving power required her to be so ruthlessly cruel that she became more monster than woman. But this explanation misses something crucial. Wu Zetian was not more cruel than male emperors. The first Tang emperor, Taizong, killed his brothers and forced his father to abdicate. The Han Dynasty founder, Liu Bang, betrayed allies and executed rivals wholesale. Chinese history is full of male rulers who murdered their way to power and then presided over prosperous reigns. The difference is that when men did it, it was seen as the unfortunate necessity of politics. When Wu Zetian did it, it was seen as evidence of female monstrosity. She ruled for 15 years as emperor. During that time, she continued the policies that had made her effective: meritocratic examination systems, Buddhist patronage, efficient administration, and brutal suppression of opposition. She was approximately 80 years old when palace officials finally forced her to abdicate in 705 CE, restoring her son to the throne and ending the Zhou dynasty. She died that same year, shortly after her abdication. She was buried alongside Emperor Gaozong in a joint tomb that still exists today. Her tombstone, by her own instruction, was left blank. No words, no epitaph. Scholars have debated for centuries what this blank stone means. Was it humility, suggesting her achievements were beyond words? Was it defiance, refusing to let history judge her? Was it acknowledgement that her legacy would be contested forever? But perhaps the blank stone means something simpler and more disturbing: that Wu Zetian understood she had transcended categories. She was not a good empress or a bad empress, not a capable ruler or a cruel tyrant. She was something that Chinese tradition had no vocabulary to describe: a woman who held the ultimate male power, who murdered her own child to achieve it, who tortured thousands to maintain it, and who ruled successfully for half a century, despite violating every norm about gender and authority. And the question that haunts her story, the question that makes her one of history's most dangerous queens, is this: was she extraordinary because she was cruel? Or was she forced to be cruel because she was attempting something extraordinary? Would a woman rising from nothing to supreme power in 7th century China have been possible without the baby murder, the torture chambers, the 1,000 deaths? Or was all that violence the price that patriarchal society demanded from any woman who tried to rule? The answer to that question determines whether we see Wu Zetian as a monster who happened to be competent, or as a brilliant administrator who was forced to become monstrous by the system she was trying to overcome. And that question, more than anything else, is what makes her story relevant not just as history, but as a continuing debate about power, gender, and the costs of ambition. Section 3. The blank tombstone. You are in the Qianling Mausoleum in Shanxi Province, modern-day China, standing before Wu Zetian's tomb. It is one of the best-preserved Tang Dynasty imperial tombs, built on a mountain with spectacular feng shui. The approach is lined with stone statues, lions, horses, officials, carved from massive blocks, weathered by 13 centuries but still imposing. And at the tomb entrance stands the most famous feature. A massive stone stele 30 feet high, completely blank. No inscription, no eulogy, no explanation. Just smooth stone, deliberately left empty by Wu Zetian's own instruction. This blank stone has haunted Chinese historians for 1,300 years. What did it mean? Why would the only female emperor in Chinese history choose to be remembered by saying nothing? The debates about this stone mirror the debates about Wu Zetian herself. Was it humility or arrogance? Wisdom or defeat? An acknowledgement that her deeds were beyond words, or an admission that words could not justify what she had done? But to understand the blank stone, you need to understand Wu Zetian's final years, when age and political realities finally caught up with the woman who had murdered, tortured, and maneuvered her way to absolute power. By 700 CE, Wu Zetian was 76 years old. This was an extraordinary age for the time. Life expectancy in Tang, China was approximately 35 years. She had outlived most of her enemies simply by existing longer than they did. But age was finally diminishing her powers. She was not as sharp mentally. She tired more easily. She began to rely more heavily on her advisors and favorites, and this dependence created vulnerabilities. Enter the Zhang brothers. Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong were handsome young men from a minor aristocratic family, probably in their 20s when they entered Wu Zetian's service in 697 CE. They became her favorites, and the historical sources strongly suggest they were her lovers. This scandalized the court. Wu Zetian was in her 70s. The Zhang brothers were young enough to be her grandsons. The relationship was seen as not just inappropriate but grotesque, evidence that the elderly empress had lost her judgment. But Wu Zetian did not care about propriety. She had never cared about propriety. She elevated the Zhang brothers to high positions, gave them titles and wealth, listened to their advice on policy. They were not particularly qualified for the positions they held, but they were charming, entertaining, and most importantly, they made her feel powerful and desired rather than old and failing. The problem was that the Zhang brothers were incompetent administrators, and they were greedy. They accepted bribes. They sold offices to the highest bidders. They made enemies among the legitimate bureaucracy, and they created an opening for Wu Zetian's many enemies to finally act. A conspiracy formed. It involved several of Wu Zetian's own sons, generals who resented the Zhang brothers' influence, and Confucian officials who had spent decades waiting for an opportunity to restore proper male rule. The conspirators were careful. They did not frame their plot as opposition to Wu Zetian herself. That would be treason, and she still commanded fear even in her weakness. Instead, they framed it as rescuing the emperor from evil advisors who had deceived her. In 705 CE, the conspirators struck. Led by Zhang Jianji, a chancellor, and Li Duozuo, a general, they entered the palace with armed troops. They killed the Zhang brothers in Wu Zetian's presence. The elderly emperor, too frail to resist, too confused to understand what was happening, could only watch as her favorites were cut down. The conspirators then presented Wu Zetian with an ultimatum: abdicate voluntarily and live out your remaining days in comfort, or refuse and be forced out, possibly killed. She was 81 years old, surrounded by armed men, her lovers dead at her feet. She had no real choice. She abdicated. After 15 years as emperor and decades of de facto rule before that, Wu Zetian gave up the throne she had killed to obtain, the power she had tortured to maintain. Her son Li Xian was restored as Emperor Zhongzong, the Tang dynasty was officially restored, and the brief Zhou dynasty was erased from official chronology as if it had never existed. Wu Zetian lived for 10 more months after her abdication, confined to a remote section of the palace. The conspirators did not harm her physically. Killing an elderly, defeated woman would have been seen as cowardly, and would have risked turning her into a martyr. But they isolated her completely. She saw no visitors. She had no influence. She was essentially erased from politics while still alive. She died in December 705 CE at age 81, The official cause was old age and illness, which was probably accurate. She was buried alongside her husband Gaozong in the joint tomb she had commissioned decades earlier, and she left instructions that her tombstone should be blank. Why? The traditional interpretation is that Wu Zetian was acknowledging that her reign was too controversial for any epitaph to be fair. If the inscription praised her, critics would call it propaganda. If it acknowledged her crimes, supporters would call it slander. Better to leave it blank and let history judge. But there is another interpretation, darker and perhaps more accurate. The blank stone was a final act of defiance. Wu Zetian was refusing to explain herself, refusing to justify her actions, refusing to beg for posthumous vindication. She had done what she had done. She had ruled China for half a century. She had been the only woman to hold the title of emperor. No inscription could change those facts, and no inscription was needed to make them meaningful. The blank stone says, "I do not need words to defend myself. My life is the defense." So what is Wu Zetian's legacy? How should history remember the woman who murdered her infant daughter, tortured thousands, and ruled successfully for decades? Chinese historians for centuries portrayed her as a cautionary tale, proof of what happens when women seize power they should not have. Traditional histories emphasized her cruelties, her sexual appetites in old age, her violation of proper gender roles. They acknowledged her administrative competence but framed it as making her even more dangerous, like a skilled swordsman who uses their talent for murder. But modern historians, particularly feminist scholars, have begun to re-examine Wu Zetian. They point out that she was no more cruel than her male counterparts. Tang Dynasty history is full of emperors who killed rivals, purged officials, used terror to maintain power. The difference is that when men did it, it was called politics. When Wu Zetian did it, it was called monstrosity. They also point to her genuine achievements. She did reform the civil service, making it more meritocratic. She did expand education, creating opportunities for commoners' sons. She did patronize Buddhism in ways that gave women more religious authority. She did rule effectively during prosperous decades. These were real accomplishments that improved real lives, and they cannot be dismissed simply because she killed people to achieve power. But here is the uncomfortable truth that makes Wu Zetian's story so disturbing. Both interpretations are correct. She was monstrously cruel, and she was a capable administrator. She murdered her own child, and she reformed the government. She tortured thousands, and she promoted education. These contradictions do not cancel each other out. They coexist, and that coexistence forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power. The first question: is violence necessary for women to achieve power in patriarchal systems? Wu Zetian lived in a society that gave women no formal authority, that saw female rule as cosmic violation. The only path to power required breaking every rule, eliminating every opponent, creating such fear that tradition itself became irrelevant. Could she have achieved what she achieved without the murders and torture? Probably not. The system would have destroyed any woman who tried to rise through legitimate means, but does that justify the baby's death? Does it excuse the torture chambers? Can we celebrate Wu Zetian as a feminist icon when her path to power required destroying other women, Empress Wang, Consort Xiao, who were also trapped in the same oppressive system? The second question: does competent rule excuse ruthless methods? Wu Zetian's reign was prosperous. The empire functioned. People's lives improved in many ways. If a ruler eliminates 1,000 enemies but improves the lives of 1,000,000 subjects, what is the moral calculation? Traditional Chinese political philosophy, influenced by Confucianism, would say that a ruler's legitimacy comes from maintaining harmony and prosperity. By that standard, Wu Zetian was legitimate, but Western ethical frameworks, particularly modern human rights concepts, would say that prosperity cannot excuse torture and murder. By that standard, she was a tyrant. The third question, the most disturbing: what does Wu Zetian's story reveal about the relationship between power and gender? She proved that women could rule as effectively as men. But she also demonstrated that doing so required adopting the same ruthless methods that male rulers used. She became emperor by behaving like emperors behaved, eliminating rivals, inspiring fear, using violence strategically. This suggests that the problem is not female rule, but rule itself, that absolute power corrupts regardless of the ruler's gender. But there is a twist. Male emperors who murdered rivals were seen as strong. Wu Zetian doing the same things was seen as unnatural. This double standard suggests that society judges women leaders by different standards, expecting them to be both powerful and gentle, authoritative and nurturing. Wu Zetian rejected that impossible standard. She claimed power and used it exactly as male emperors did, and history has struggled ever since to know how to categorize her. In 2012, Chinese state media ran a poll asking citizens to vote on the greatest Chinese empress in history. Wu Zetian won by a landslide. Modern Chinese people, particularly women, see her as a proto-feminist icon, a woman who refused to accept limitations, who proved that women could rule, who achieved the impossible through strength and intelligence. Her methods are acknowledged but somewhat excused by the era she lived in and the opposition she faced. But this celebration makes some historians uncomfortable. Are we really celebrating a woman who murdered her own baby? Are we holding up as a role model someone who tortured thousands? Does women's achievement of power justify any method used to obtain it? These questions have no easy answers. Wu Zetian's legacy is fundamentally ambiguous, and that ambiguity is precisely what makes her story relevant. She was not purely good or purely evil. She was a human being operating in a corrupt system, using that system's own methods to achieve power it normally denied to people like her. She broke the ultimate glass ceiling, becoming emperor in a society that said women could never rule, and the cost was measured in blood. The blank tombstone acknowledges this ambiguity. It refuses to resolve the contradiction. It stands as a monument to the possibility that some lives are too complex to be captured in words, some legacies too contested to be summarized, some questions too profound to be answered. You stand before that stone today, 13 centuries after Wu Zetian's death, and you realize that we are still arguing about her. Feminists claim her as a pioneer. Traditionalists condemn her as a monster. Historians debate whether her reign should be celebrated or mourned. And the stone remains blank, offering no guidance, forcing each generation to decide for itself what Wu Zetian means. Perhaps that is the most dangerous thing about her. Not that she killed so many people, not that she violated so many norms, but that she forces us to confront our own values about power, gender, and the price of achievement. She refuses to be easily categorized as hero or villain. She demands that we think complexly about questions we would prefer to answer simply. And in that sense, Wu Zetian remains dangerous even now. 13 centuries dead, her body dust, her empire vanished. She is dangerous because her story will not let us rest easy in our judgments. She achieved the impossible and paid for it with atrocity. She proved women could rule and demonstrated the cost. She left a blank stone that says, "Decide for yourself what this means." That is her final victory, making us participants in the debate rather than passive observers. We cannot read about Wu Zetian without taking a position, without revealing our own values, without exposing what we believe about power, gender, and human nature. The baby died. The 1,000 officials were tortured. The empire prospered. The woman ruled. And the stone says nothing. What do you say? Subscribe our channel for more historical stories. Story 2. Agrippina the Younger, the Roman Mother, who poisoned an emperor and slept with her son. Section 1. The Mushroom Dinner. Opening hook, maximum shock. You are in the Imperial Palace in Rome on October 13th, 54 CE, watching a murder unfold in slow motion. Emperor Claudius sits at the dining table, surrounded by his family and advisors. He is 63 years old, overweight, prone to drooling, physically awkward but mentally sharp. He has ruled Rome for 13 years. He has expanded the empire, conquered Britain, built aqueducts and harbors. He is not loved, but he is effective. Tonight he will die. The woman who will kill him is sitting across the table. Her name is Agrippina the Younger. She is his wife. She is also his niece, the daughter of his brother Germanicus. Their marriage was technically incest under Roman law, but Claudius changed the law to make it legal so he could marry her. This should have been a warning. When someone rewrites fundamental social rules to possess you, you should question their ultimate intentions. But Claudius did not question. He was infatuated with Agrippina, who was beautiful, intelligent, from one of Rome's most prestigious families. She was also ruthlessly ambitious, and Claudius failed to recognize that her interest in him was purely instrumental. She married him to become empress. She schemed constantly to ensure her son from a previous marriage, a teenager named Nero, would inherit the throne instead of Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. And now that Nero has been officially adopted and designated as heir, Claudius is no longer useful. Worse, he is becoming a liability. He has begun to express doubts about the adoption, to mention that Britannicus is, after all, his actual son. He has begun to notice that Agrippina is positioning Nero to take power immediately, not waiting for Claudius to die naturally. Agrippina cannot allow these doubts to develop into action. She needs Claudius dead before he can change his will, before he can restore Britannicus as heir. And she needs it to look natural, or at least ambiguous enough that she cannot be directly implicated. She has chosen mushrooms. Claudius loves mushrooms, particularly a variety called Amanita caesarea, Caesar's mushroom. They are delicious, expensive, a delicacy that only the wealthy can afford regularly. Tonight the imperial kitchen has prepared them specially, seasoned with garum, fermented fish sauce, herbs, and wine. The dish is served to Claudius steaming and aromatic. What Claudius does not know is that one of these mushrooms has been substituted. Instead of Amanita caesarea, it is Amanita phalloides, the death-cap mushroom. They look similar to the untrained eye. Both have greenish caps, white gills, white stems, but one is delicious and safe. The other is one of the most poisonous organisms on Earth. The substitution was arranged by Helotus, the emperor's official food taster. Agrippina has been cultivating him for months, through a combination of bribery, threats, and seduction. Helotus knows that if he refuses to cooperate, Agrippina will have him killed. And if he does cooperate, she will reward him richly. It is not a difficult choice for a servant with no loyalty to the emperor. Claudius eats the mushrooms. He compliments the chef. He drinks wine and continues his dinner conversation. For approximately 6 hours nothing happens. This is how death-cap poisoning works. The toxins, primarily amatoxins, do not cause immediate symptoms. They are absorbed in the intestines, enter the bloodstream, and begin attacking the liver and kidneys at the cellular level. The victim feels fine initially. Then, 6 to 12 hours after ingestion, the first symptoms appear: nausea, vomiting, severe abdominal cramps. Around midnight, Claudius begins to feel sick. He vomits several times. He has diarrhea. His stomach cramps painfully. This is not immediately suspicious. Food poisoning is common enough that even emperors experience it. The palace physicians are summoned. They administer remedies, herbs, prayers, bloodletting. Nothing helps. What no one knows except Agrippina is that the worst is yet to come. Death-cap poisoning has a characteristic pattern. After the initial gastrointestinal symptoms, there is a deceptive recovery period. The victim feels better. The vomiting stops. They think they are recovering. But this is an illusion. During this period, the toxins are systematically destroying the liver. Cells are dying. Organ function is failing, and there is no antidote, no treatment, no way to stop the process. Claudius experiences this false recovery. By the morning of October 14th, he feels somewhat better. He manages to eat a little. He conducts some business. He reassures everyone that he is fine, that it was just a bad meal. But by evening, he collapses. His skin turns yellow with jaundice as his liver fails. He becomes confused, delirious. His blood pressure drops. His kidneys stop producing urine. He is dying. and the physicians finally realize that this is not ordinary food poisoning but something far worse. Agrippina, throughout all of this, remains calm. She tends to her husband. She summons the best physicians. She appears distraught, worried, the devoted wife nursing her sick husband. But she is also carefully controlling who has access to Claudius. She keeps Britannicus away, preventing the emperor from having any final conversation with his biological son. She ensures that Nero is visible, present, the designated heir who is standing by ready to assume power. Claudius dies on the morning of October 13, 54 CE, less than 24 hours after eating the poisoned mushrooms. The official cause of death is recorded as illness, probably food poisoning. There is no autopsy. Roman emperors are not dissected like ordinary citizens. Their bodies are sacred, but everyone suspects the truth. The timing is too convenient. Agrippina benefits too, obviously. And mushroom poisoning, while not uncommon, is suspicious when it happens to an emperor whose wife has strong motives to kill him. The ancient historian Tacitus, writing decades later, states flatly that Agrippina murdered Claudius. Suetonius agrees. Cassius Dio confirms it. The sources differ on some details, exactly which meal contained the poison, whether Halitus or the physician Xenophon delivered it, but they all agree on the essential fact. Agrippina killed her husband to make her son emperor, and she succeeded. Hours after Claudius's death, Nero is proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard. He is 16 years old. Agrippina is 43. She has achieved what she spent years planning. Her son on the throne, herself as the power behind it, control of the Roman Empire. But this is just the beginning of Agrippina's story, because the woman who poisoned her husband is the same woman who, according to some ancient sources, engaged in an incestuous relationship with her own son. The woman who manipulated her way to supreme power is the same woman who would eventually be murdered by Nero in one of history's most elaborate and horrific matricides. And to understand how all of this happened, you need to understand who Agrippina was, how she became so ruthless, and what drove a woman from one of Rome's most noble families to murder, incest, and ultimately her own destruction. Agrippina the Younger was born in 15 CE in a Roman military camp on the Rhine frontier. Her father was Germanicus, one of Rome's most beloved generals. Her mother was Agrippina the Elder, a woman known for her virtue and her fierce loyalty to her family. Agrippina the Younger was named after her mother and was born into the highest tier of Roman aristocracy. Her great-grandfather was Emperor Augustus, Rome's first emperor. This should have guaranteed her a life of privilege and security. Instead, it guaranteed her a childhood of trauma and terror. Roman imperial politics in the 1st century CE were catastrophically dangerous for anyone with a claim to power. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family that descended from Augustus and his stepson Tiberius, was locked in constant internal warfare. Family members plotted against each other, accused each other of treason, murdered each other regularly. Being related to emperors was not an advantage. It was a death sentence waiting to be executed. When Agrippina was 4 years old, her father Germanicus died mysteriously in Syria. The official cause was illness, but everyone suspected poison. Ordered by Emperor Tiberius, who saw Germanicus as a potential rival. Agrippina's mother, Agrippina the Elder, became convinced this was true. She openly accused Tiberius and demanded justice. This was a fatal mistake. You do not accuse Roman emperors of murder even when they are guilty. Tiberius had Agrippina the Elder arrested, exiled, and eventually starved to death. Her 2 eldest sons were also eliminated, one exiled and killed, one imprisoned, until he committed suicide. Young Agrippina watched her family be systematically destroyed. By the time she was 13, her father was dead, Her mother was dead, two of her brothers were dead, and the remaining brother, Caligula, had become emperor, but was showing signs of the madness that would characterize his brief reign. These childhood experiences shaped everything Agrippina would become. She learned that family could be eliminated in an instant, that power was the only security, that survival required ruthlessness. She learned that women in the imperial family were particularly vulnerable. They could not hold office or command armies, yet they were targeted as threats simply for existing. She learned that the only way to be safe was to be powerful, and the only way to be powerful as a woman was to control the men who held formal authority. When her brother Caligula became emperor in 37 CE, Agrippina was 22 years old. Caligula initially favored his sisters, granting them unprecedented honors. He had them included in the loyalty oath that citizens swore to the emperor. He had their images on coins. He gave them seats at public games and theatrical performances. For a brief moment, it seemed like Agrippina might have security through her brother's affection. But Caligula was mentally unstable. His initial generosity toward his sisters morphed into something darker. Ancient sources, particularly Suetonius, claim that Caligula had incestuous relationships with all three of his sisters, including Agrippina. These accounts are difficult to verify. Roman historians were not above inventing sexual scandals to discredit people they disliked. But whether the incest was real or rumored, it created a devastating scandal that damaged Agrippina's reputation permanently, and then Caligula turned on her. In 39 CE, he accused Agrippina of participating in a conspiracy against him. The evidence was probably fabricated, but evidence did not matter. Caligula had her exiled to the Pontine Islands, a barren prison off Italy's coast. Her property was confiscated. Her son Nero, who was 2 years old, was left in the care of an aunt who was given no resources, forcing the child to grow up in poverty. Agrippina spent 2 years in exile, watching the horizon, waiting for news that Caligula had ordered her execution. But in 41 CE, Caligula was assassinated by his own guards. His uncle Claudius became emperor, and one of Claudius's first acts was to recall Agrippina from exile, restore her property, and return her son. Agrippina was 26 years old. She had survived exile. She had survived her brother's murderous insanity, and she had learned the most important lesson of all. The only way to be truly safe was to control the emperor yourself. She set out to do exactly that, and the first step was to marry Claudius, who was her uncle, making their union technically incestuous even by Roman standards. But Claudius was infatuated, and Agrippina was willing to exploit that infatuation for power. She married him in 49 CE, becoming Empress of Rome, and then she began positioning her son Nero to inherit the throne, systematically eliminating anyone who stood in his way. This required years of patient manipulation, bribery, threats, and eventually murder. By 54 CE, she had achieved her goal. Claudius had adopted Nero and designated him as heir over his own biological son. All that remained was to ensure Claudius did not change his mind. Which brings us back to the mushroom dinner, the slow death, the widow who was not grieving but triumphant. Agrippina had won. Her son was emperor. She was the power behind the throne. She had survived everything Rome's imperial politics could throw at her and emerged victorious. But she had also created a monster. Nero was 16 years old, raised by a mother who taught him that power justified any crime, that family members were tools to be used or obstacles to be eliminated, and eventually, Nero would apply those lessons to the woman who taught them. The question that makes Agrippina one of history's most dangerous queens is this: did she create Nero, or did Nero's nature simply mirror hers? Was she teaching him to be ruthless, Or was she enabling something that was already there? And when he eventually turned that ruthlessness against her, was it betrayal or just the logical conclusion of the values she had instilled? To answer those questions, you need to understand the relationship between Agrippina and Nero, a relationship that some ancient sources claim crossed into incest, that certainly involved Agrippina trying to control her son even after he became emperor, and that ended with one of history's most elaborate and horrifying murders. Would you like to continue to Section 2 of Story 2? Section 2. The Mother Who Would Not Let Go. You need to understand what the ancient sources claim about Agrippina and Nero, because these claims, whether true or exaggerated, reveal something important about power, control, and the corruption of family relationships when imperial politics becomes involved. According to Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, Agrippina used sexual seduction to control her 16-year-old son after he became emperor. They describe her appearing in Nero's chambers at midday, when he was relaxed from wine and food. They describe her dressed provocatively, behaving in ways that were inappropriate for a mother. They claim, though with varying degrees of certainty, that the relationship crossed into actual incest. We cannot know if this is true. Roman historians were not above inventing sexual scandals to discredit people, particularly powerful women who violated gender norms. Agrippina was exactly the type of woman Roman male historians hated: ambitious, politically active, controlling men who technically outranked her. Accusing her of incest served multiple purposes. It explained her influence over Nero. It portrayed her as monstrously unnatural, and it made both her and Nero seem morally corrupt. But even if the incest was invented or exaggerated, the underlying dynamic was real. Agrippina absolutely tried to control Nero. She had spent years positioning him to become emperor. She had murdered to put him on the throne. She was not about to let him rule independently. She intended to be the power behind the emperor, to make all real decisions while Nero performed the ceremonial functions. And initially, this worked. When Nero became emperor in 54 CE at age 16, he was compliant. He attended Senate meetings, with his mother sitting behind him, listening to everything, sometimes whispering instructions. When foreign ambassadors came to the palace, Agrippina received them alongside Nero as if they were co-rulers. Imperial coins from the early months of Nero's reign show Agrippina's profile on one side and Nero's on the other, both facing forward, equal in prominence. So, this was unprecedented. No Roman woman had ever shared imperial imagery this way. Empresses appeared on coins but smaller in profile, clearly subordinate. Agrippina presented herself as Nero's equal, and for a brief time Nero accepted this. But he had advisors who resented Agrippina's control. The most important were Seneca, a philosopher and rhetorician who served as Nero's tutor, and Burrus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. These men were competent administrators who wanted to actually run the empire rather than serve as Agrippina's puppets. And they recognized that as long as Agrippina controlled Nero, they would never have real authority. So they began working to separate mother and son, subtly at first, then more overtly. They scheduled meetings when Agrippina was not present. They advised Nero to make decisions without consulting her. They introduced him to other sources of pleasure and distraction, particularly women, that competed with his mother's influence. Nero, discovering the pleasures of actual power and the satisfactions of independence, began to resist his mother's control. The first major break came over a woman named Acte, a freedwoman, a former slave who became Nero's lover. Agrippina was furious. Act was socially inappropriate, far beneath the emperor's dignity. More importantly, she was someone Agrippina did not control. If Nero was going to have a relationship, Agrippina wanted to choose the woman, someone she could manage. When Nero refused to give up Acte, Agrippina escalated. She reminded him loudly and publicly that she had made him emperor, that everything he had was because of her, that he owed her absolute obedience. She threatened to support Britannicus, Claudius's biological son who was still alive and represented an alternative heir with a potentially stronger claim to the throne. This was a catastrophic mistake. You do not threaten emperors even when they are your son, and you absolutely do not suggest that someone else might have a better claim to the throne. Nero, frightened and angry, decided that Britannicus needed to be eliminated. At a palace banquet in 55 CE, Britannicus was served wine. He drank it and immediately collapsed, convulsing. Within minutes he was dead. The official explanation was epilepsy. Britannicus had a history of seizures, but the timing was too suspicious, the symptoms too consistent with poison. Everyone understood that Nero had murdered his stepbrother to eliminate a potential rival. And Agrippina, watching this murder of a boy she had once competed against, but who was ultimately just a victim of imperial politics, realized that she had created something she could no longer control. Her son had learned from her that murder was an acceptable political tool. Now he was using that tool independently, without her permission, and if he could murder Britannicus, he could murder anyone, including his mother. The relationship deteriorated over the next few years. Agrippina tried to maintain influence through various methods. She cultivated her own faction in the Senate. She reminded Nero's advisors that she knew secrets about how Claudius died, implying she could destroy Nero's legitimacy if she chose. She attempted to use guilt, reminding Nero of everything she had sacrificed for him. None of it worked. Nero was discovering that being emperor was actually enjoyable. He loved the adulation, the luxury, the artistic patronage. He began to fancy himself a performer, singing and playing the lyre at public events, which horrified the Roman aristocracy, but which Nero found personally fulfilling. And he resented his mother's constant interference, her insistence that she knew better, her inability to let him simply be emperor without her supervision. The final break came over another woman, Poppaea Sabina. She was beautiful, aristocratic, married to Nero's friend Otho. She was also ambitious and intelligent enough to recognize that becoming Nero's wife would give her enormous power. But there was an obstacle. Nero was already married to Octavia, Claudius's daughter, whom he had married as part of Agrippina's original plan to secure his succession. Poppaea wanted Octavia gone, divorced or killed so she could marry Nero herself. And she recognized that the main obstacle was not Octavia, who was powerless, but Agrippina, who would never permit Nero to divorce Claudius's daughter because it would weaken his legitimacy. So Poppaea did something brilliant and vicious. She started telling Nero that his mother was too controlling, that he was not really emperor while Agrippina lived, that the only way to be truly free was to eliminate her, and she implied subtly, never stating it directly, that a son who truly loved his mother's rival more than his mother would prove it by choosing her. This planted a seed that would grow into matricide. But even Nero, who had already murdered his stepbrother, hesitated at killing his mother. This was different. Matricide was one of the ultimate taboos in Roman culture, considered so unnatural that it was almost unthinkable. Even hardened criminals who had committed multiple murders balked at killing their mothers. But Nero was being pushed by Poppaea, encouraged by advisors who wanted Agrippina gone, and increasingly paranoid about his mother's potential to destroy him. And Agrippina, sensing the danger, made everything worse by becoming more desperate. She started appearing at the palace uninvited. She would show up at Senate meetings and demand to be heard. She sent messages to Nero alternating between pleading and threatening. She cultivated relationships with palace guards and officials, trying to build a faction that could protect her. And according to some sources, she even offered to share Nero's bed again if that had ever happened, in a desperate attempt to regain the influence she once had. These actions, whether accurately reported or exaggerated by hostile historians, portrayed Agrippina as increasingly unstable and desperate, and they convinced Nero that she was dangerous, that she might actually try to overthrow him, that the only way to be secure was to eliminate her. But how? Openly murdering your mother would create enormous scandal. The Roman public might tolerate many things, but matricide was beyond the pale. It would damage Nero's legitimacy, might trigger a military coup, could turn popular sentiment against him. He needed a method that would allow him to kill Agrippina while maintaining plausible deniability. Some way to make her death look accidental or natural. He tried poison first. Appropriate. Given that his mother had pioneered the method, he had poison administered to Agrippina multiple times over several months. But she had anticipated this. She had been taking small doses of various poisons for years, building up tolerance. This was a known practice among Roman aristocrats who feared assassination. The poison made her sick but did not kill her. Nero tried a different approach. He arranged for the ceiling of Agrippina's bedroom to collapse while she slept. The plan was to make it look like an accident. Old building, structural failure, tragic death. But the attempt failed. Either the mechanism malfunctioned or Agrippina was not in the room at the expected time. She survived, and she knew it was not an accident. Her son was trying to kill her. Agrippina sent Nero a message. She knew he had tried to murder her. She forgave him. She hoped they could reconcile. This was either genuine maternal love surviving despite everything, or it was a tactical move. By acknowledging the attempt openly, she made it harder for Nero to try again without appearing obviously guilty. But maternal love, or tactical genius, meant nothing against imperial paranoia. Nero had decided his mother must die, and his advisors were now fully committed to making it happen. The failed attempts had only made the situation worse. Agrippina knew she was in danger. She could not be allowed to live, to potentially turn against Nero, to reveal secrets about Claudius's death, to become a rallying point for anyone who opposed the emperor. A new plan was developed, more elaborate than the previous attempts. It involved a boat, the Bay of Naples, and a mechanism so theatrical that it seems almost unbelievable. But the ancient sources agree on the basic details, and the plan's very absurdity is what makes it credible. No historian would invent something so bizarre. Nero invited Agrippina to a festival at Baiae, a resort town on the bay. He was apologetic, loving the devoted son seeking reconciliation. He hosted a banquet in her honor. He walked her to the dock afterward, embraced her, and personally escorted her onto the boat that would take her home across the bay. The boat had been specially constructed. The ceiling was weighted with lead but designed to collapse on command. Planks in the hull were loosened so the boat would take on water and sink. The plan was for the ceiling to fall, crushing Agrippina, and then the boat would sink, destroying any evidence. If she somehow survived the ceiling collapse, she would drown when the boat went down. Either way, it would look like an unfortunate accident. Tragic boat failure. Emperor's beloved mother lost at sea. But Agrippina survived. Again. The ceiling collapsed, but it killed the wrong person, her lady-in-waiting who was sitting next to her. Agrippina was injured but conscious, and when the boat began to sink, she realized what was happening. This was not an accident. Her son was trying to murder her, and he had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it look otherwise. She escaped the sinking boat and swam to shore. She was 53 years old, injured, swimming at night in the Bay of Naples. She survived through sheer will and the same ruthless determination that had gotten her to this point. She reached land and was taken to her villa. And now she faced an impossible choice. What do you do when your own son, the emperor you made, the boy you raised, has tried to kill you 3 times and will certainly try again? Agrippina sent a messenger to Nero, reporting the accident and assuring him she was fine. This was her final attempt at survival through denial. By treating the attempted murder as an accident, maybe she could force Nero to back down, to let her live. But Nero, panicked that she had survived, and terrified that she would now turn against him publicly, made the final decision. He sent soldiers to her villa with orders to kill her directly, brutally, without subtlety or deniability. The time for clever schemes was over. He was going to murder his mother openly, and he would deal with the consequences. When the soldiers arrived, Agrippina knew there would be no escape this time. And her response, according to the ancient sources, was both defiant and heartbreaking. She faced the soldiers, according to Tacitus and Suetonius, and exposed her abdomen, the womb that had carried Nero. Her reported last words were, "Strike here. Here is the womb that bore such a monster." The soldiers stabbed her repeatedly. She died in her villa, murdered by order of her own son, the boy she had schemed for, killed for, and ultimately created into the man who destroyed her. But the question that makes this story so disturbing is not just that Nero killed his mother. Many rulers have killed family members. The disturbing question is, did Agrippina deserve this? Did her own ruthlessness, her murders, her manipulation, her possible incest, justify what Nero did to her? Or was she simply a woman trying to survive in a system that gave women no power except through men? And was her destruction the inevitable result of trying to hold power she was never allowed to have officially? So to the end, PLZ, like and subscribe our channel for more historical stories.